What up, y'all? I'm Dr. CBS here with Dr. Jared Ball, and you're tuned into episode 4 of The Last Dope Intellectual. All right, so for this week's Shoot the Shit, I want to talk about all things Black Power Media, which we just launched. We had our launch on February 17th. We were joined by basically the whole squad as it's currently constituted. We had even announced some new people that are going to be joining, namely No Name, right? Is going to have a monthly show. So, I just want to shoot the shit with you about it, Jared, because, this has been an idea that is years in the making. You've actually approached this previously to no avail. So can you talk a little bit about what your previous visions were and why you think it is that now, like it popped off now and it's now, coming into fruition?
No, I appreciate it. Well, yeah, you're right. For a long time, I've been trying to figure out how we can work with different variations and formations to put something like this together, because going back to even the days of my time involved with the media reform conferences in the early 2000s, and even specifically seeing the rise at the time of the Huffington Post, and how it went from its origins to what it is now, both good and bad. So I was initially just saying we should be doing the same thing, which is basically just creating a hub, because despite, and this has always been where I've run, to borrow another one of your segments, in the DAT course, in terms of how we relate to the internet and social media. So I've always been arguing that it is not a playing field leveler, and that we have to organize and use it in similar ways that we would organize and engage other media or other technologies, and specifically to create a news public sphere, a Black radical public sphere that would house, a variety of the Black radical tradition ideas, and allows
tradition
them
of radical Blackness. We talk about the tradition of radical Blackness around these parts, but I feel you. I knew what you were saying.
Thank you for the correction. I don't mind that. Exactly. But to allow that to flourish and to say and to echo beyond the individual and often, impressive efforts of others. So anyway, but I think the biggest struggle was, I think, the perception of what the internet provided in people's individual ability to post and impact the public discourse. And I think over time, it's become clear that we do need to develop some cooperation, some collaboration, some platform sharing. And I think that between COVID and the rise of streaming and even the admitted contradictions of ad revenue through YouTube and other platforms, has made it possible for, I think, people to see the possibility, and for us to do it. And the timing it couldn't be more, ripe, given the state of the discourse and the state of our politics and the state of certainly our material conditions. So anyway, so I'm just glad and very excited that we're finally able to pull this together, and it is expanding and it is exciting. And I think it has infinite potential. So
yeah. So now thank you for that. So I just want to point out that my shirt says, "Fuck this shit." Nat Turner, 1831. Okay. And this is, first of all, I just like this shirt, but also we have gotten some feedback that Black Power Media has so much profanity and, to the point where, perhaps the niggerati shouldn't be recommending our channel to the children. Now, we want to talk about profanity. To me, it is what is profane is the inundation of our youth and our community in general with all of these shows celebrating pigs, celebrating imperialism, celebrating particular tropes of criminalization among our people. Like, if we want to talk about profanity, let's talk about the profane messages that are being spoon-fed to us in the mainstream media, and even on some of these YouTube platforms. And so, yeah, we might say fuck or shit or damn or whatever. That's peppered in with like truth, though, right? And so, number one, we're not trying to corrupt your youth, okay? But if they go to school, if they on TikTok, if they watch TV, they're gonna hear this language. But I think that the broader purpose is to combat those negative images and combat the straight up misinformation and disinformation with which they are subjected in curricula, right, in media, and just in everyday life. And so it's really wild to me how people can try to undermine radicalism with any arbitrary thing like the use of profanity. And I'll just say personally, I am one who cusses all of the time. I've cussed since probably the first grade because I remember a professor telling me, or a teacher telling me, profanity is the effort of a feeble mind to express itself. Mind you, at this time, I'm in gifted and talented education. So I was like, fuck that. That can't possibly be true. So ever since then, I've been cussing. I say what I want. I do what I want. But I know you take a slightly different perspective based on one of our ancestors. So what's your perspective on this?
Well, first, I mean, philosophically, personally, I agree with you. In my private life, in my I fully agree with you. I just admit that over the years, well, part of it is just being in public broadcasting for a while, where you were prohibited, somewhat legally and financially from the language. Sort of a conditioning that way, but mostly I have been impacted over the years by something I heard Kwame Ture say in a lecture, I don't know, years and years ago, where essentially he said that we shouldn't cuss in front of our people, that is something that we adopted negatively from the white bourgeoisie and their approach to their communities, and that when we're doing our work, and that we should be more, I guess, professional in our language. But so I admit impacted by that. So when I do public work, for the most part, I don't cuss as I, is in my private life as a former sailor. I do cuss like one. So, I mean, so it's not philosophically that I disagree with what you're saying. It's just in terms of just what ends up happening, even unconsciously. It's a struggle for me. I have to make myself say it. But to your point, it is important to point out the difference in terms of what our children get between something like a fuck you and fuck capitalism. So I think, there is, and anyway, so censorship, of course, is political, and we don't, and the latter version of what I just expressed is the only version that gets censored. Everything else we hear, expressed all the time, negative references to women, to so-called people of color. I mean, it's just all the time. So anyway, so again, philosophically, I fully agree with you. It's just a practice I've picked up over the years.
Well, in honor of Baba Kwame Ture, I do not cuss in front of our people. I cuss beside our people and in lockstep with our people. So, all right. So this is so here we go, y'all. This is something to monitor. If it is that Black Power Media, we stopped using profanity on our channel. It was Jared. He censored us. So keep that in mind. That is what happened. And, but in all seriousness, I mean, I just think more importantly than, it's not as if I intentionally use profanity, but I just want us all to show up as we are, to show up and drop this knowledge and to be in communication and communion with our, with our folks. And that, and if people want to use profanity, fine. If people want to, use respectability, however they see fit, fine. But as long as it's not doing violence against our people, and as long as, as I said, the messages are not profane in terms of promoting colonialism, neocolonialism, imperialism, patriarchy, capitalist exploitation, et cetera, then it's like, whatever. So, ma'am, that's how I feel about that. If this was one of the shows you was mad about, ma'am, don't fucking watch it. How about that? So,
enough said. I mean,
and don't send your children to Carleton College. And if you do, tell them not to take my classes because I cuss in there too. Period. Okay. So the last thing, that I've been thinking about is how do we keep this channel with integrity without sort of what the inevitable creep in of like chasing fame or popularity or making it too much about money, even if we're sharing the profits collectively, right? Like, how do we keep it? So like for me, for example, like I have a real job. I'm not a media person. Like, this is not my job. This is just something I want to participate in. And so I've tried to set aside, okay, like 5 hours a week to work on, Last Dope Intellectual. But it's seductive, and especially if it is that, we're offered particular types of sponsorship, et cetera, et cetera. It's like, how are you going to keep us, Jared, as our guiding light? How are you going to keep us on the straight and narrow, keep us honest, all this? Like, what do you think about that?
Well, to this last point of this guiding light joke, but it's serious. The point for me is that this is one reason why I think being part of organizations, being part of collectives is important. You've referenced him in your work. Certainly I have in mind. Dr. James Turner has even encouraged us directly to behave this way. In part, I think, at least as I interpret it, to put those kinds of checks and balances in right there. I would find it very hard to imagine that working with you or Kamau or Kalanji or the Lukmans or any of the others that we have in this association so far, never mind who's coming next. I have a hard time. Like Chajua,
yeah.
I mean Rosa, I mean No Name. I mean, can you imagine any of these people sitting quietly as I or anyone else started to lead us more towards a neoliberal commercial? I mean, so I just think that would be very difficult. I can't imagine anybody sitting quietly and letting that happen. So even if it did start to creep in that direction, the checks and balances I think are already built in. Plus the content we already see. We already get sort of again throttled. We get a lot of the yellow lights on our content because we're not ad suitable to advertisers and all that kind of stuff. So there's those kinds of checks and balances just in the content. And just in the people who we've already invited to work with and who we're expanding to. I mean, I just think it makes it impossible to make that mistake, or at least a lot less likely. So I think working collaboratively and sort of some organized effort with a clear ideological perspective helps protect against all kinds of potential problems. And certainly that's one of them.
All right, Jared, keep it 100. Do you want to be famous? Do you want to be a judge on The Voice?
No,
let's be honest.
No, I don't. No, but here's what. But let's be 100. 100. What I want to be, if famous is the right word, what I always want is to have a positive impact and to be recognized for it in the circles within which we work.
Sure.
That's where I want the fame in that kind of sense. So I admit that I want to make such a positive contribution to this struggle that people in this struggle recognize it in whatever way that means, and recognize whatever positive impact it brings. That's what I do. So I do want that. I admit that, and that's always been part of the work I've done, even when so-called in the background. That's what I want. I admitted last time, like I am Dustin Hoffman and Wag the dog. I'm the one that gets dragged off and killed by the state because I want my credit. I admit that, and I admit it. It could be a flaw at times as well. But yeah. So 100, I do. I want people in this struggle. I don't want Voice and Vote That and I don't want Nick Cannon fame. I want. But I do strive for, again, what Kwame Ture said, when you work for the people, you are always respected and cared for, and you always have a home. That's the kind of fame I would want. So absolutely. Yeah.
Okay. I'll take that. All right. So, Black Power Media, man, tune in, watch all of our content. We'll be, we go live, we have shows. We feature each other on our platform, and we hope to continue to grow and get this editing together. Right now, it's just sort of like we're on the ground floor. But y'all remember Flavor of Love first season versus Flavor of Love second season? The weaves got better, the shooting got better, the lighting got better. And look at the Real Housewives season 1 to now. Like you know how it is. This is
that's the goal. We say it all the time. We're striving for season 2 of Flavor of Love standards. That's
period.
What we talk about all the time.
Yep, exactly. So stay tuned. While I have y'all, the last thing I want to talk about is, so I want to start a segment called The Doctor's In, where Jared and I answer whatever questions y'all got. So y'all can send us questions and we will answer them. So Jared, this is the first you're hearing of this, but welcome. So
I love it.
So here's what I want y'all to do. If you go to dr-cbs.com / whatever that slash is, contact. So drcbs.com and click the contact tab. Basically, you can submit a question. So just put in the subject line, The Doctor's In, or question or whatever, or you can tweet me at BlackLeftAF or shoot me a message on Instagram, BlackLeftAF. And, we'll answer whatever questions y'all got. I can answer scholarly questions if you got questions about something you're working on, to anything about radicalism, book recommendations, whatever, anything y'all want us to answer. We reserve the right to say no. So if it's some personal raggedy stuff, don't expect answers to that. But write in, and that's going to be fun, I think. And we definitely want to incorporate some of your voices into our platform. So dr-cbs.com / contact, or tweet me, BlackLeftAF. Send me a message on Instagram, BlackLeftAF. So that is our shoot the shit for this week's episode. All right, y'all. I am so excited today for our interview segment. We have my girl, Dr. Layla Brown Vincent, to talk about her work, to talk about growing up in a movement family, to talk about, what it means to have sister, comrade, friends in the academy. So I'm so excited for this conversation, but let me just read her bio first. All right. Dr. Layla Brown Vincent is a member of the All African People's Revolutionary Party, GC, Guinea-Conakry, and currently works as an assistant professor of Africana Studies at the University of Massachusetts, Boston. Layla earned a PhD in cultural anthropology from Duke University in her home state of North Carolina, where her research focused on Black racial identity formation in Latin America and the U.S. and its impact on Black radical organizing in the era of Black Lives Matter. She is currently working on her first book manuscript, Return to the Source, The Dialectics of 21st Century Pan-African Liberation, which is based largely on her dissertation research. Layla spent all of 2020 as a visiting research fellow at the Johannesburg Institute for Advanced Study, where her research expanded to examine the crisis of racial capitalism and the COVID-19 pandemic. And let me just tell y'all, I was salty about that year-long sojourn in South Africa because she forgot about your girl, but I've forgiven her. Anyway, her most recent scholarly work, The Pandemic of Racial Capitalism, Another World is Possible, can be found in From the European South, a transdisciplinary journal of postcolonial humanities. And we're going to talk about that article. So welcome, Dr. Layla Brown Vincent.
Can I just say that I think you're going to bring me onto this show to talk about radical sisterly comradeship and say that I left you behind for a year. That is not, those two don't jive. So I don't even know how to feel about that.
Did you or did you not go to South Africa for a year? And I talked to you maybe 12 times?
Lies and deceit. I did go to South Africa. However,
I will say, in what was that, February 2020, you flew in for other reasons, but did come see me when I was in Massachusetts. We did link up. So
thank you.
I take some of that bitterness back, but only some.
Yes, I literally flew across the Atlantic Ocean and then drove 2 hours to see you and hang out with you. You're not going to do like that.
That's fair. Okay, I'm so excited to have you here, Layla. All right, so let's start out with this first question about your upbringing. So you grew up in a movement family, and you happen to be the niece of the famous, the prodigious Bob Brown of the AAPR-PGC. And then you became a scholar activist. So can you talk a little bit about why you chose to do your PhD in cultural anthropology, and how have you balanced your intellectual work with your organizing and activism work?
So, I mean, there's a lot of different ways to start that conversation. I would have to say that, like, growing up in my family, I was surrounded by books, surrounded by by political organizing, surrounded by like the level of, I think, kind of political engagement and thought that even my parents, I don't think, realized that I had really fully digested until I got older. And so, I think we're in a slightly different moment in social history. And so, you gotta figure out a way to exist in the world. So I went to North Carolina Central University for undergrad, and I was a history and Spanish double major.
And a Delta.
Yes, I am a Delta.
Skiwi.
Don't hate.
Not Kamala Skiwi, but anyway, please continue.
You know what? A lot of my mentors are AKAs, and you know what my favorite thing to say to them is?
What?
Better for your children.
Okay, I'm gonna let that go so you can finish your story.
Anyway, you made me start train of thought. You're a fool. Oh no! So I went to North Carolina Central University, and I was studying history and Spanish. And like the reason why that even came about, like I grew up, around a number of different international communities. I was named by my parents Palestinian and South African friends and American Indian movement. So in a way, even though I hadn't really left the country as a young person, I felt like I grew up with the experiences of people who had lived everywhere. And so that was one of my goals, right, in college. And so I got to study abroad a couple different times. I went to Mexico for a summer, which was great. I went to the Dominican Republic for a semester, which was awful. And and I should be fair, it was awful because I think that the Dominican Republic and Spain, because of their particular racialized histories, are places that people of African descent, particularly people of African descent that are darker than a certain hue and who wear their hair natural, need particular kinds of trigger warnings about. And, my experience as a Black woman being, racialized or nationalized as Haitian, although there's absolutely nothing wrong with that, it's just that I'm not Haitian, created a lot of, I think, particular kind of racialized and gendered experiences, like going to school every day. I would be accosted like I was a prostitute, right? And so it actually made me start asking questions about, what is it about the way race is constructed in the Dominican Republic, but in the Latin American context in general. Fortunately, I had two really good teachers at the time, Blas Jimenez, who was a poet, a literary scholar, and Juan Rodriguez, who was actually an anthropologist, who helped me kind of make sense of these particular histories between the Dominican Republic and Haiti, and the ways in which the Dominican Republic racializes itself as non-Black vis-a-vis Haiti as this sort of Black republic. And that kind of, that spurred my interest in Latin America, in questions of race. And then, like most people, when I got ready to go to grad school, I didn't know what I was going to do. But what I said to myself, it's real. Like, even when I was in college, I had planned on being an English teacher. And it was because of the kind of high school English teacher on top of that. It was the mentorship that I received that pushed me to consider graduate school. And I was like, I don't necessarily want to study language. I want to continue to use language, but I don't want to study language. And I don't want to do a whole bunch of archival research, which, jokes on me, still did that anyway. But I was like, okay, how does this work? And anthropology is kind of what I fell into. And then anthropology for me was just really useful because of, ethnography as a central method, right? A way of, experiencing, being true to your sort of experiential way of learning and existing. And for me, that was also a way to continue to contribute to social and political movements while contributing both in a sort of material sense and in an intellectual sense. And so for me, that was, the way that it made sense. And I had a family that was very invested in that work always. In fact, it was my father who even suggested Venezuela. As I was getting ready to consider graduate school, he was like, there's some interesting stuff happening in Venezuela. Like, Venezuela has the potential for your generation to be what Cuba was for a lot of diaspora, for that generation. And for a while it was. I think there are a lot of interesting things happening now, but that's kind of what took me there.
That is amazing. That's such an interesting story, especially the ways in which mentorship shaped your path. I feel like I was just kind of like, I'm gonna do this now. It's so funny how drift and how arbitrary shit be, and you go back and you ascribe meaning to it. But so, for example, I applied to 2 PhD programs because I didn't want to take the GRE, and I was like, well, it's gonna be the Academy or the Pole. let's see how it goes. And it worked out that it was the Academy.
Academy or the
both were viable. Both were viable. Don't play me. So anyway,
I'm so tired of you.
Speaking of the poll, no, just kidding. So you identify as a Pan-African feminist. What do you mean by that? And how does that inform your work, your orientation, and your praxis?
Mm-hmm. You know, it's funny because I would say growing up, my identity as a woman in a woman's body, in a female body, it wasn't central to how I thought about myself. And it wasn't really until I went to college and really started experiencing the ways that my showing up in places as a woman dictated how people responded to me and even how they could hear me, right? Because basic aggressions, I literally just said the same thing this dude said, and somehow y'all heard everything he said, but not me, right? And in the classroom. And so for me, I think you've talked about this a lot, like your own kind of trajectory towards Marxism was very much an intellectual one. For me, that's the same. Like for Pan-Africanism, for me was an ethos, right? It was a way of life. It was how I grew up. But feminism was really an intellectual endeavor for me. It wasn't something I really pursued or considered until undergraduate, and then really even more so in graduate school. Because, I was fortunate, my mentor that I didn't name her, but Dr. Baina Muhammad, she historian at North Carolina Central University, even though she never taught any classes on feminism when I was there, I get mad at her now because she does teach classes on Black feminism now. I'm like,
your antennas, yeah.
Exactly. There was a lot that she exposed me to. And so it made me start to ask questions. And so for me, my identity as a Black person, as an African, as a Pan-Africanist is first and foremost. But I also recognize the ways in which contradictions of gender show up, and even for people who have certain kinds of political ethics, be they Pan-Africanists, be they Marxists, be they socialists, be they whatever. I think it's something that's important about being intentional about naming the particular kind of gender critique, right? Because for me, being a Pan-Africanist, the way that the AAPR-PGC understands Pan-Africanism is in the ways in which Kwame Nkrumah Sekou Touré and Kwame Touré understood it, which is as an objective. It's a political objective, right? Which is the total liberation and unification of Africa under scientific socialism, right? All of the other ways in which people, deploy and utilize Pan-Africanism, are cool, but for me, it's a political goal and an objective, right?
Period.
And so, exactly. And then for me, feminism it's a critique, right? It's a lens. It's a way of adding to that. And so for me, identifying as a Pan-African feminist is both about centralizing my racialized and sort of historicized position as a person of African descent, as a descendant of people who have been impacted by the transatlantic slave trade and the histories of colonization, but also to understand that even as we pay attention to the ways in which race and empire impact our lives, we also have to be intentional about situating the ways in which gendered oppression has taken on its own life. And I think for me, it's always important to name them together along with class, because for me, the Cuban Revolution is the sort of primary example of this. And it's the reason why, for me, the Bolivarian Revolution became even more of interest, is because, when the Cuban Revolution triumphed, the material conditions of life really changed for a number of people in Cuba. And then there was this kind of belief that the issues of race and gender were kind of settled, right? And then as soon as the Soviet Union fell, the special period opened, all of these tensions about race resurfaced, which means that they were never dealt with. What was dealt with was sort of some of, not all of, the material inequalities that people experience, but the underlying logics of Black inferiority, of sort of male superiority, were not done away with. And so to me, you can't actually begin the process of deconstructing those types of oppression without naming them first. And so for me, that's why it's important to name myself as a Pan-African feminist.
Okay. You know, our conversation about this is ongoing,
Yes,
but that's
I
very,
do.
I think that's very convincing, and I think very useful, especially for for people who are coming to consciousness at this moment, right?
Mhm.
Like, how do you want to name your politics? And beyond just naming them, how do you want to root your identity in politics, right? So, you know, something I say often now is to have identity rooted in politics as opposed to politics rooted in identity. And I think that how you just explained out Pan-African feminism is actually really, I think, you know, be a Pan-African feminist.
So I just want to say
People.
today, like, I feel like I can spend the rest of the day not doing anything, because if anybody who knows you knows that, like, ain't really your jam. And as many times as we've had conversations about this is the first time you've actually said to me that what I said to you was convincing. So I think I'm gonna sit on my couch for the rest of the day, and I got to. But other than that,
I don't, like, you know, you gotta teach later, so don't do that. But yeah. I mean, I
you know what I'm
feel
teaching my Africana feminism's class.
Yeah, and you know, you even convinced me that to apply for this canon thing, this canon feminist summer school. Well, you and Joy James sent it to me, so I feel compelled. If Joy James sends you this thing, to go for it. So
Yes.
I'm coming along, but it's not. I'm not some gender troglodyte, y'all. It's I have an actual critique of this, but
yes.
that's neither here nor there. That's for another show. Okay. Next. So now I want to shift gears a little bit to talk about your new article, The Pandemic of Racial Capitalism, Another World is Possible. And I really love that article, especially your discussion of medical internationalism. So can you speak about the relationship that you discussed in there about the relationship between COVID-19 and racial capitalism, as well as medical internationalism? And then, you know, you say another world is possible. So what is this alternative world that you see as possible through Pan-African feminism or other models?
Mm-hmm. I mean, you know, even though you hated on me for being in South Africa, I think what was really it was really useful, and I think eye-opening to watch the pandemic unfold as a person who was born and raised in the US, outside of the US, because it was and continues to be a shit show, right? The way the US is supposedly one of the most developed countries in the world is just utterly incapable of, you know, of dealing with a crisis of this magnitude, right? And especially at this point, like, you know, maybe we could argue back in February, March, April, like we still didn't really have a sense of what we're dealing with. But like at this point, we know a lot about what the virus is, what makes certain people vulnerable and susceptible. You know, even though we don't necessarily have a cure per se, we know that things like vitamin D deficiencies and rest and stress are really important. And, you know, and treating them, right? So one of the things that I started looking at was like, well, what are different countries doing, right? And so, like, you know, the kind of list of things that I named that Venezuela and Cuba were doing. I mean, so Cuba, you know, from the triumph of the revolution, really began to engage in this sort of medical diplomacy, right? So because, you know, there were two very essential commitments that the Cuban Revolution made to its people early on, which was socialized medicine and socialized education, right? But a part of what socialized medicine means for Cuba is not just that everyone has access to healthcare. It's also about a particular kind of what do you call it? Situated understanding of the way health is impacted by the environment, by all kinds of things, right? And so the way that medicine operates in Cuba is that doctors live in the communities that they serve. They're aware of the types of environmental things that are impacting our health, as well as whatever is happening or at a sort of cellular or biological level. And so, you know, I think it's really important to understand that because of the blockade, because of the sort of the US's preoccupation with what do you call it? Punishing the Cuban Revolution for daring to, you know, be self-determined. The Cuban medical system had to really focus on preventative care as opposed to palliative care, which is what I would say, you know, care in the US is like, which has meant that, you know, throughout the pandemic, I think the last time I looked at numbers, less than 200 people in Cuba have passed away because of COVID. And then in the Venezuelan case, whose education and healthcare system since the Bolivarian Revolution began in 1999 has been largely informed by the Cuban medical system. I think less than 1,500 people have died. And to me, in the Venezuelan case, that's an even greater feat because Venezuela is exactly because of the sanctions, because of the declining price of oil, because of the sort of, scarcity of basic necessities, to be able to still maintain a certain preoccupation with the quality of life in spite of all of that, to me, speaks towards a particular kind of politics. Because there were other kinds of policies that were put in place, right? So, as with less than 100 cases or something like that, I can't remember the exact number, sorry. Maduro made an announcement that, nobody would be fired from their jobs for 6 months. Nobody would be evicted from their houses. They would continue to have access to health care, all these kinds of basic, the right to life, right? I think a preoccupation with the preservation of life, which is what I argue, that, no matter how imperfect the socialist experiment that's occurring in Venezuela is, I think that there's something to the ethics of socialism that says that there's a fundamental preoccupation with the preservation of life. And in the US, that is not it. These people, they still squabbling over $1,400 a year later. Right?
That's not even funny, but it is
not
sad.
Funny. It's ridiculous, right? And so for me, the world that is possible is a world that cares about us as people. And and that cares about our lives, the quality of our life, right? As opposed to seeing us as mechanisms for exploitation to generate profit. And what's really important about that to me in this particular case is that people will often argue, we haven't seen any successful communist or socialist revolutions. What does capitalist success look like for the masses of people? It looks like suffering and disease and death.
And also, what we have to understand is that these are socialist societies in a capitalist world economy. Okay. The system of capitalism is a failure as you're saying, for the overwhelming majority of people. So, so this is what happens when you have socialist societies in a capitalist world economy. But the capitalist system as such has immiserated the overwhelming majority of the world, right? And so these are red herring arguments. And when you have things like sanctions, blockades, the CIA, right? COINTELPRO, and the list goes on. Of course, socialist societies are going to be hampered. So it's and then the other thing that I was thinking about when you were speaking is Patricia Rodney's work. And so I invite people to listen to Patricia Rodney's interview on the Groundings podcast with Dev Springer, where she was talking about her research and her book. It's like women healthcare workers. She was comparing the Grenadian case to Barbados, and essentially after the Grenadian Revolution, they had a lot of Cuban doctors come in. And so what she said was that the way in which the Grenadian people related to the Cuban doctors was very positive. It was they were very receptive. They appreciated the sort of wraparound approach to medicine, which is in contradistinction to the Barbados system, where it was much more developed, but it was the sterile Western. Doctor is the expert model, where patients feel, dehumanized, or they feel less able to speak up. There's the class politics of it all. And so I invite people to also to look up Patricia Rodney's book. It's very great, and to listen to that interview, because it speaks a lot to what you were talking about in terms of Cuba's medical diplomacy and also their approach to healthcare in general.
And the one thing I want to add, even about their medical diplomacy, I don't know how many people have been following Cuba's development of vaccines, but I just want to, so they have 4 vaccines that are running right now. But the most interesting thing to me about the Cuban vaccine trials, first of all, they have 4 different types of vaccine trials that are running, right? That treat the virus in different ways. But the most interesting thing to me about vaccine trials is that Cuba does not have enough sick people in their population to run successful trials, right? So they've had to they've had to outsource the trials to Iran and other places, right? And so that in and of itself, right, to me, it actually speaks to something even broader. Cuba itself does not necessarily stand to gain in an immediate material sense from the work that they're doing, from the socialized medicine that they're doing, because their population is relatively healthy. The work that they're doing is about a commitment to a global crisis. And again, that is what I think socialism perpetuates, right? Like the a part of what's happening in the US is the Johnson & Johnson and the Pfizer vaccine. They have bought up all of these vaccines, right? Still can't figure out how they want to disseminate it. And it means that folks on the continent of Africa and Latin America might not have access to vaccines until 2022, and some people not as late until 2023, 2024. The work that Cuba is doing is about a commitment to a global state of health that, that doesn't even necessarily immediately benefit their population, because their population is generally well, right? And so, I think that those are logics. And to me, that is the world that is possible. A world where our preoccupation is for our well-being and our health, right? And when I say health, I don't just mean physical health, but our mental health, our psychological health, like all of these different types of things, as opposed to, our current existence in the US and in these sort of, capitalist, neoliberal dominated countries. So that, that is, my research historically has really been about Pan-Africanism. And I would argue that like this iteration of the work is not so much about Pan-Africanism in the traditional sense, but what I think for me, it's about a particular kind of logic and an ethos, a way of being and living and existing in the world that I think is better for all of us.
Yeah. So, I, often speak about ethics, epistemology, and politics, and that's really what you're talking about. It's like, it's not just the material reality. It's like, how do we internalize the ethics of that? We rationalize that a huge segment of the population should just die, and that's okay, right? And when we talk about disproportionality and all that, what that can lead to is that, okay, as long as the ruling class has 13% Black folks, because there's 13% of the population, then it's okay to have a ruling class. That's a particular ethical commitment, right? And that's also, it's epistemological. It's the way we understand the world. And so I think your work is really important in challenging both of those things, because that's the internalized nature of it. Those are the hardest things to root out, right? Because like as they say, if the only tool you have is a hammer, everything will look like a nail or whatever. So related to this, right? So like me, you're currently working on a book project, and the struggle. Well, I don't know about for you. I do know a little bit about for you, but like the struggle is realer than real to get this thing done. So can you tell us what your book is about, and like, what is it like writing your first single author manuscript, man? Like, be out here.
It's torture.
It's hard.
So, okay, look, I should say this. I struggle with writing. I really, really do. I struggle with writing because for me, the way that I learn, process, internalize, deal with things is social. And for me, writing is not social. The process of writing is not social. Obviously, published material creates a particular kind of sociality, but the process of writing is not social. And, I think actually people like you have actually made me make writing more social than what it has been for me. And I think that that's really one of the problematic ways that we're trained in graduate school, is that they try to make us think that in order to be successful at this thing, you got to go sit in a corner somewhere and be by yourself.
You got to be a fucking troll in the library with your cloak and your stack of books and getting boils and shit like Karl Marx. Nobody doing that. Like, we want to thrive and flourish in the sun. Like,
honey, the sun. Okay, let's not even. I think it was when you did the podcast with Adam McNeil, when you were talking about your like ideal space to write and stuff. Communal and sunshine and food and like green. Like, listen, I've become a plant lady. This is like all of my plants are like my way of creating some kind of life inside. But anyway, Anyway, so, and I'll also say though that like I knew to push back on that like conception of writing early on. Because one of the things that always bothered me about grad school is that they say, you'll come to a point in your research where like your family and your friends, they just won't understand and you won't be able to talk. That was never the case for me. And it was, and
granted, but let me stop you there. Because your daddy read everything, okay?
He does, but he don't have no degree. But he don't have no degree. And that's
but you're able to, I'm sure you're able to have particular types of conversations with your parents, your dad, your brother who's a physicist. Come on. So I'm just throwing that out there.
But it's not just them. It was also my grandfather who didn't go to school past 8th grade. But who saw it as important to put his 7 kids and wife through college, right? So it wasn't just that, and also beyond that. So that there may be some truth to the fact that the nuance of a particular issue may require a little bit more work to explain.
Sure. Mm-hmm.
But then the question that I would ask for those of us who claim that we're concerned with the freedom of our people, what does it mean that we do work that we can't talk to our people about? It don't mean shit. It don't mean shit.
Right.
So like for me, really. And so for me, I don't think that I would have survived graduate school had I not done it close to home. Like if I had gone and tried to like cut myself off, I couldn't have done it. And so like, for me, the process of writing this book is like somewhat of a traumatic return to the dissertation writing process. But it's also been nice, I think. This is the one thing I'll say. The one good thing that has come, I think, out of this COVID moment. You and I, like over the last couple of weeks, we've had like 2 or 3 days a week where we've just logged in and looked at each other and written, right, and tried to do work. And I realized that I am a person who needs external accountability, and so
most people do.
Yeah, and I think an important component of your process is realizing like who you are. So like I can write all the plans and I can put all the blocks on my calendar, but if somebody don't say, "Hey, Layla, let's do this," Layla is gonna be watching TV. She's gonna be something else. Or like prepping for class or doing something else that feels more doable in the moment, because this book still seems like this huge thing. But I think, the smaller public outward facing things like the blog posts, like the interviews, it helps get me energized about the book project again, because it reminds me that people are really invested in the essence of the project. And so the essence of the project, so I started doing my dissertation research around 2010, 2011. So this was a couple years before Chavez passed. The Bolivarian Revolution was still doing fairly well, but this also happened to be the time that Trayvon Martin was killed. The movement for Black Lives Matter, and the movement for Black Lives was sort of picking up. And so a lot of what the book is concerned with is the way that grassroots organizing among people of African descent in the U.S. and Venezuela is this sort of kind of 21st century return to a Pan-African ethos. And the way that comes about for me is literally from the process of doing field work. When I first started going to Venezuela, the amount of people that I encountered who were just like random people from the US who may or may not have had some kind of academic background, but who wanted to come to Venezuela to see what was going on. I was like, oh shit, like this is cool. Like people are like, there's some here. And then as I was in Venezuela, people started asking me, well, what's happening in the US, right? And then there were so many of these interesting parallels, because I think another interesting parallel at the level of the state was that both of these movements, so the Network of Afro-Venezuelans and the Movement for Black Lives in the US, were proliferating under the first self-identified Black presidents, right? Very different. So Chavez is Afro-Indigenous. We know Barack Obama is Black and white. But to me, there was... But there were particular questions for me about the way that Afro-descendant organizing was looking on the ground in Venezuela, in a country that was pushing itself towards Bolivarianismo, what some people later would call Chavismo, or what Chavez called 21st century socialism, and what it meant for the Bolivarian revolution to take seriously the issues and concerns of Afro-descendants in that particular country, what it meant in the US, that the prison population was like, expanding exponentially. One of the sort of largest moments of social upheaval around sort of anti-Black racism and structural inequality that Black people experience occurred under our first Black president. And so for me, there were a lot of like interesting points of comparison. And again, for me, as a person who doesn't actually identify that much as an optimist, like finding hope in what was happening in Venezuela, right? And one of the things I think, even to this day, even as the Venezuelan government struggles with sanctions, whatever, one of the things that I think the population has maintained is that they voted for Chavez and his successor Maduro, and in spite of their issues with Maduro in this particular moment, what they know is that is the person they want to struggle with. That is the government that has taken seriously their issues or concerns, even if they've done so perfectly. And what we know as Black people in the U.S. is that this place ain't never loved us, right? Like one of my chapters in my dissertation was "Never Loved Us," and it was because the Dream Defenders at the time had taken Drake's song "Motherfuckers Never Loved Us" as a mantra, and it's a way of thinking about Black relations to the state of the U.S., right? Like that we never loved us, never cared about, our prospects for life. And so the book project explores that both from a sort of ethnographic, social movement perspective, but it's also, for me, an important return to the canon of Pan-Africanism. And that's the intellectual project of the book, I think. One of the things I encountered when I was in grad school, one is that a lot of the people that I encountered just had not read or were not familiar with Nkrumah's work, Sekou Touré's work, Nyere's work, all these different kind of Pan-African statesmen, but also thinkers, right?
Right.
And, some people like Shilin Bembe, who was trying to push his Afropolitanism at the time, made arguments like Pan-Africanism was passé, right? And so for me, I think that there is an important kind of situated knowledge that needs to be acknowledged. And this is why, for me, even why I don't, as much as the work of Marx, I think, contributes to all of the work that I use and do, which is why I don't necessarily center Marx, because for me, it's important.
Who does?
A lot of people.
We center, I think we engage, I know I'm being facetious, but we engage our people who engage Marx. It's like, how did they take up Marx and Lenin and Mao, Bukharin and the whites?
Exactly.
We start with the Negro question, so to speak, or the African question,
Exactly.
Yeah.
And I think that for me, there is an intellectual project in that. Like, and you and I have talked a lot about this, the Black studies canon in the sort of broad, expanded way, but also I think in, not relegating Pan-Africanism to this moment of African independence.
Right. Yeah, the dustbins of history and shit. Like, hey, it's out here. Yeah.
And as much as I utilize the understanding of Pan-Africanism as a political objective, there's also work that these people did to be thinkers, to be theorists, to ideologues, to use a word that's a little bit problematic. But I think it's important, if we are thinking about ourselves as scholars of Black life, that we also take seriously people who have theorized our experiences from our particular historical and material realities. Yeah. And so for me, that, and a lot of people tell me like this project is like broad and expansive, and, to use one of your favorite words, capacious. And but the thing is, I think that our lives are that. Like, there's no way for me to to do the work. And this is also why autoethnography is another both method and form of writing that I use, because one of the things that was really difficult when I was in grad school was to make it make sense. The people they were like, why are all of these things coming in? And for me, I realized that it was my upbringing that made all of those things make sense without having to do any kind of particular work. And so telling my own story in that was a way of making the questions make sense.
See, I feel like I don't want people in my business. So I'm the complete opposite. Like, I tried to just write about things at a level of abstraction because it's like, don't worry about what I got going on. This is what I'm talking about. So I understand what you're saying.
And I think that's another thing that feminist politics does for me, is that it takes embodied knowledge and experience seriously, and as a place from which we theorize, right? And so that is why I ain't really concerned about, we always make editorial decisions. There are things that I won't say, and not even just about me. There are things I won't say about the people that I do work with because of their goals and objectives, and what is useful and not useful to actually put on paper. Because the thing is, as much as we imagine ourselves as writing for the benefit of our people, we know our enemies are always reading and listening to our shit too. And so anything that we put down on paper can be used to our benefit or our detriment. And so we're constantly making, those kinds of decisions. But that for me is, that's the essence of the project. And it's, it's still overwhelming. So,
yeah, but we doing it. That's the thing not to forget. Like, you're writing a book. Cause I'm like, we're writing our books. It's just, it's a struggle bus, but we on it. We're on that raggedy ass struggle bus, and we're doing it. So, just in our last few minutes, the last thing I wanted to talk about is and you mentioned it some about the ways in which we're trained to be individualists, that our work should be in isolation and in some ways in competition. But we've managed to maintain Black colleague, comrade, friends, sisterships in the academy, right? And so we actually met about a year ago. No, 2 years ago, 3 years ago. Yeah, 2 or 3 at that History Makers conference. I will reserve judgment about that. But, and just me basically making you talk to me like, hey girl, leaning on you and stuff. I mean, there was wine involved, I admit, but since then we've basically, we've been inseparable. So, South Africa notwithstanding, but but you were also part of our junior faculty mastermind group before you went to South Africa, and we're just patiently waiting for you to return. And that was another collective that we organized to just do this process together, to go through tenure and promotion together. So how has what I would call mutual comradeship, this sort of collective approach to the work, how has that helped you navigate the academy, along with relationships with other Black radicals or Black folks like your mentors and such?
It has literally been my saving grace. There's no way that I would still be here were it not for that. And what's funny about when we met, right? We were at this table. And it's so crazy. Me and you were sitting next to each other and not talking to each other. You're talking to everybody else around this table. And I think you heard say something about Chavez. And then you were like, oh. And then it just went. And so for me, what was genuine, I think, about our connection was that, we saw each other as 2 young people, 2 Black women, whatever. But it was your fundamental interest, not necessarily in my research, but in the same things that I was interested in. And for me, that I had graduate school was so isolating for me. I really struggled. I was the only Black person in my program. I was the only Latin Americanist in my program at the time. Obviously, nobody was thinking about Pan-Africanism in any way, shape, fashion, or form, and thinking about Black women. So it was just what am I doing here? To be honest, I don't even. Navigating that whole grad school process, I didn't know what I was doing. I had not a clue. And I think I still have not a clue about navigating this tenure process, but I feel like having other folks through the masterminds, other folks that I've met, just to know, one, to have some mutual commiseration, but then 2, to also You need it sometimes. But mutual support, I would not be here. Like I literally would have left.
Yeah.
And it's funny because my dad always told me that. He was like, you can't do this shit alone. Like you have to have community, period. Like whatever it is. And I'm so like grateful to be able to like shoot you a text or call you and be like, these motherfuckers are trying to kill me.
They tried it yet again. Listen, I have dumped my whole purse out about my 3rd-year review, among other things. So yeah, I definitely feel you 100%. Like it's definitely a lifeline.
Yeah. And then even, we about to enjoy, a good, I don't care what nobody say. We in the middle of COVID, we about to go have a writing retreat.
We're going to Miami on a writing retreat. Judge us. Yeah. Judge us. And, we'll have more about that later. But yeah. So we've reached the end of our conversation. But anything else you want to add? Where can people find you?
So on Twitter, I'm PanAfric with a K, Fem_PhD. I don't really I'm not a good social media person. I'm trying to be better. My little academia.edu. I don't even have a real website. I'm janky. I'm still trying to be, some kind of professional. But yeah, you can find me there, the academia.edu and Twitter. And be on the lookout for these things. I think I've got some stuff at AIHS on their blog. Be writing some more for them. And apparently, you and I will be having some more collaborations in the future. So I'm looking forward to that too.
Absolutely. Well, thank you so much for joining me, Layla Bean, as I like to call you, that you hate. But thank you for being here. This was such an amazing and wonderful conversation. So I look forward to having you back.
Thank you for having me.
All right, y'all, for this segment of In These Tweets, we have a very, very, very special guest. One of my favorite tweeters in the world, Nina Monet, aka Wild Fonts. Nina Monet, Wild Fonts. Y'all have to follow this account. So what we're going to do, Jared and I are going to just pull up some tweets from her timeline, and we're just going to talk about it. So Welcome, Nina. Do you want to introduce yourself?
Hi, I'm Nina. I don't really have an intro beyond that. I identify as an abolitionist. Beyond that, I'm still learning. I'm still figuring this shit out. I advocate for Black children. So that's me.
So like what you said about your advocacy of Black children brings us to the first tweet I want to talk about. And it's really a thread. And I thought I was an academic battle rapper. You be going ham on these goofies. Okay. So let me just read this. All right. So you started off this thread. This from February 18th. You said, Black people do not need tough love. Black children do not need tough love. We do not need to be cruel to one another because the world is hard. And if being mean to children, beating them, calling them lazy, and denigrating them and making them feel worthless keeps them safer and help them succeed, we would be thriving as a people. And then you go on from there. And there was a lot of responses to them. And you actually later on outlined all of the Goonie responses to this whole thread. So do you want to, can you talk a little bit about what you wanted to convey and then some of the responses and then some of your responses to those responses?
Absolutely. So that particular thread was in response to a viral video of a teacher talking to a group of Black children about them not performing. And she was saying, it was a Black teacher, and she was saying, I don't care about your reading levels and test scores. Basically, I just want you guys to perform. But I don't understand what the issue is and what's holding you back. Are you guys just lazy, or you just don't think you can do it? And recently, actually, on an episode of the Drop Squad podcast that I co-host, we actually talked about, I started a conversation about how I always experienced cruelty from Black administration when I was a kid. Teachers, administrators, they were always really mean. And they did this thing that they considered tough love, where they would talk down to you, they would chastise you, they would, belittle you, and call it keeping it real, and say that they're doing it for your best in your best interest because, we as Black people got to tell each other the truth about how hard the world is out there. But it doesn't make kids feel any safer. It doesn't make them feel any more empowered. And the kids don't need more people telling them that they're doing something wrong and there's something wrong with them. And so, I was breaking down that thread about why, as someone who's been a teacher for over a decade, why I saw that as harmful and how that plays into systems and cultures that are harmful to Black children. And how, as people in community with Black children, our role is to uplift them and to inspire them and to encourage them and to try to, and that's how you encourage them to do better, basically, and not by breaking them down. And not surprisingly, but like I said in the thread, not surprisingly, but always disappointingly, there was a lot of pushback on that. Like, oh no, life is hard. The real world is hard. We got to break them down. We got to show them tough love. We got to prepare them for the real world. Because if we don't do it, the world's going to do it worse to them. And I'm just like, again, like I said in the thread, if that model was successful, then we would be succeeding, because we have had an abundance of tough love all throughout history from a community, especially. If beating Black children, if, talking down to them, if trying to make them submit was what was going to make them succeed, Black boys wouldn't have the lowest graduation rates and Black girls wouldn't be, being pushed out of schools. And if this was a successful model, we would be seeing success, seeing it play out successfully in education. And instead, Black children have the worst education outcomes of all children. So clearly that's not what we need to be doing. And clearly the issue isn't them. That's the other thing, is that this creates an idea that the problem is Black children and not the systems that they're being funneled through. So yeah, the other issue was that I was pointing out that saying, what's wrong with you guys? Are you lazy, or do you just not think you can do well? Is posing it as though there's something wrong with the children, not the systems and the institutions that they're being pushed through that are anti-Black and perpetuate childism by design and function. It's them that's the problem. It's them that needs to change. It's them that needs to do different, and not that we need to create better systems for them. And that's why I say that, like, the foundation of my politics is a fight against anti-Black childism, because anti-Black childism informs anti-Blackness. I mean, childism informs anti-Blackness, and then informs sexism, informs ableism, informs all these other forms of oppression. And then there's a specific way that childism is upheld against Black children, that, like, where the anti-Blackness and the childism compound. And so it's like, in learning to understand how vulnerable Black children are, and how much childism is harmful to them, and how much we have to, like, understand how unprotected they are, and understand how pathology and treating them as though they are the problem is normalized. It challenges me to interrogate that in all other areas, in the way that we engage each other as Black people, in the way that we engage disability and ability conversations. Like, it informs all of that. So like, one of the things I wanted to convey in that thread is that, like, we need to be more aware of the fact that it's not us that's the problem. It's the conditions we're in. We don't need to be harder on each other. We don't need to have less compassion for each other. We actually need to have more compassion for each other. We need to be more accountable to each other. We need to have more grace for one another, because the world is already so hard for us.
Thank you for breaking that down. It was an amazing thread. And I just, I enjoyed not only the, the seriousness of what you were tweeting, but also just, again, how you just shut down the extra stuff. So
listen, I tell everybody, like, I've been poor my entire life. I am generationally poor. I have been bullied. I have been, denigrated. I have had people talk down to me. I've had, adults talk down to me as a child. Like, there's nothing you can say to me that I haven't heard. And through all of that, I learned to be ruthless with my mouth. And so, like, you can't hurt my feelings, but I promise I can hurt yours.
Period.
And if it wasn't already dealt with and taken care of, didn't Dr. Stacey Patton in her work clarify all this about not beating kids, Black kids in particular, that this does not work? And then lastly, I would just want to say thank you, because we had to deal with that in my own household. A Black woman teacher in my daughter's school chastised a room full of Black and brown children and said, "This is why you all going to end up in prison. This is why you all end up in prison."
The debtor in jail speech is what I'm very familiar with. Like,
anyway, so thank you. Absolutely.
Black administrators would tell Black kids that when I was in school all the time, like, about like silly shit. Like, not only is it like a terrible thing to say to children in general, but like about pants sagging or talking in class, you're telling little boys that's why if you keep doing this, you're gonna end up dead or in jail, and you're calling that uplift.
Well, let me tell you something. One of my friends is a principal, and part of what she was doing was going bad on the colorful hair, and they wanted to institute a ban on children wearing colorful hair, and they were saying, that's not respectable. That's not how you
Mm-hmm.
job. And it's like when you're conveying this to children and they see all the women around them with these different types of colorful and, colorful hairstyles, what you're saying to them is that they don't deserve respect. And that the reason for their economic conditions or the reason why they're treated in a particular way is because of their hair. That's what you're conveying to these children, alongside telling these children that when they have these hairstyles, they deserve to be punished and they deserve to be censured. So it's like, with friends like these, who needs white supremacy?
Exactly. It's the respectability politics is always blaming Black folks for our conditions. And it's, this idea that there's this idea that we can behave a certain way that's going to make white supremacy and anti-Blackness not a thing. Like if you have a certain appearance or a certain, you talk a certain way or you have a certain education, then just racism goes away, which we all know is not a thing. But also, again, you're putting the blame, especially on children, for the conditions they navigate. You're telling them, and again, you're justifying harms against them, because then when something happens to them, it's their fault. Well, you shouldn't have been sagging your pants. You shouldn't have had colorful hair. You shouldn't have been talking slang or whatever. Like it's always their fault that these things are happening to them, and not a result of conditions of systems of institutions that need to be dismantled.
So Gerald, what did you find? Y'all, this timeline is popping. I'm telling you, Gerald, what did you find?
I mean, there was so much. I had to whittle it down, but the first one,
I be tweeting too much.
Well, I'm not going to debate or argue that. You can make that determination on your own. But I will say, for whatever the quantity issue is, there's a lot of quality. So at least you cover that. It's a fascinating follow. Well, I did pick two, but one I start with. You started off on February 22nd saying something that I think about a lot in my own work. You said, I'm a writer. I like writing, and my goal is to be able to feed myself on writing alone. Writing is something I'm passionate about and enjoy doing, but it's not, to me, revolutionary on its own. And then you have an extensive discussion of that. But I really appreciated that point about trying to moderate and understand or, appropriately relate or ratio or whatever the work we're doing to the broader struggle. And Dr. CBS, it sounds a lot like the conversation you just had, at least a portion of, with Sister Layla a moment ago. Where does our work, the value of our work end, or its contribution to the struggle begin, or somewhere in there, something like that. So I really, and then you have an extensive thread discussing and following that up, but maybe you want to just maybe elaborate a little bit or summarize a little bit of what you meant there.
Yeah, absolutely. So that thread was inspired by just a lot of conversations I'm seeing happening on Twitter, and especially around, like revolutionary organizing and the importance of Black left media or, counter narratives in the fight against white supremacy, which I won't say is not important. But for me, as someone, again, who's poor and who's generationally poor, I tend to point out what I see as overfixations. And, for a while, it was an overfixation on reading theory. Everybody read theory, read Marx. And this idea that everybody has to read the same books and everybody has to talk about having read those books, and that if you read enough of the same books and have enough conversations with people who have read those books, that somehow that you are doing something radical, or that you are anti-capitalist, or you were fighting the system in doing that alone. And I got into recently I got into a Twitter beef with some people about that, because I was like, fuck reading Marx. I'm not going to read Marx. Like, let it go. I'm not going to read Marx. But if you want to read Marx and then come to the table in community with a plan for how reading Marx has helped you better serve Black children, and what you're going to do with the things that you've learned from reading Marx, and you're going to apply them to the conditions of Black children, of poor Black children, and how we're going to take care of them and get their needs met and protect them, then absolutely come to the table with that. But don't tell me that I got to sit down and read Marx. I got to read 3,000 pages of Marx, and then you read 3,000 pages of Marx, and we got to go back and forth about what was said and what he meant before we can do any actual fucking work, because that's not true. And that's not real. And that's not doing anything for poor Black people, and especially poor Black children. So I'm pushing back against the overfixation on, reading theory with no actual application or material gain happening as a result of reading that theory. And then, now there's this overfixation on media. And now everybody's like, oh, well, we'll all start a podcast. no shade. We'll start a podcast and we'll talk about it, and we'll talk about the conditions, and we'll educate people. We'll do political education through our podcast, and that's the work. And again, I'm not going to say that like there's not a need for counter narratives, there's not a need to have these conversations, and there's not learning that happens in these spaces. But to me, it just seems like there's a lot of work being done to circumvent doing actual work. There's a lot of work being done to circumvent actual investment in community, actual sacrifice, actual struggle, actually going in community, putting up your money, your time, your resources, connecting with people in your community, making actual material sacrifices, and building things together, and organizing together, and figuring out how we can use our resources together to make real change, and to make sure people are protected, and to make sure kids can eat, and people have childcare so they can go to work, and just different things that actually will change people's conditions right now today. Everybody just wants to have the conversation and then not do anything with that. And so like. Again, I write about my experiences. I write about being a poor single mom. I write about the experiences I've had being in homeless shelters and domestic violence shelters. I write about, how this world wasn't made for us. And I think it's important for me to share those stories. It's good for me. People tell me that they benefit from reading my stories. They like hearing my stories. That the relationship I talk about with my daughter helps them with their parenting or whatever. And I think, oh, that's great. But I think that more than that, the work that I do is the work that I do in community with people in my actual lives, the way that I show up for kids in my actual life, the sacrifices I make to make sure people in my community are fed in real life. That's the communal work, not just me writing about the experiences part.
I think that's really important. And, Hood, like, I think it was Hood. Yeah. Hood Communists had, they tweet often about joining organizations. I joined an organization. A lot of this stuff is online currently because of the pandemic. But I see this as a galvanizing moment to, at some point, and Ajamu talked about this yesterday, at some point we need to just get back to the in-person stuff with matching up or whatever, because that's what's happening. And I think that, to your point, the podcast, the books, the blogs, all that shit needs to be to the end of galvanizing, of agitating,
right,
for things on the ground. It's not like my presence is a present, kiss my ass. It's not that. It's not like this is all I need to do. It's like, this is a means toward an end, not the end in itself.
Exactly. Because if all we're doing is all starting podcasts and all becoming public figures, are we really communists, or are we reproducing capitalism? Are we really doing work, or are we just making money off of talking about the struggle? Like, so it's just like, if people are talking about the investment is in, creating alternatives to these systems, and trying to figure out how we can organize a fight back against these systems and community, we have to be actually doing that, and not just all prioritizing our individual security and how we can make money being a voice of a certain issue.
Yeah. Yep. Public figure. That's my worst one right there. Okay. Here's a tweet that I want you to talk about. Okay. This was from November 2020. You said, folks who see their Blackness as a secondary identity have no business talking to those of us who understand our Blackness as foundational to our experience about anything ever. What did you mean by this?
Okay. That tweet. How do I put this? There's a lot of bastardization of intersectionality that happens in online discussion, or maybe it's not bastardization. Maybe that's how the theory was intended to be implied, and I understood it differently. I see Charisse, but yeah. So like, I don't agree with stacking up identities and making it seem like being in a certain body makes you inherently radical, or means you're inherently incapable of committing harms, and like all of the ways that I see the theory applied, I don't like. So, but from that conversation has come this kind of universe. Trying not to go to a Jared Sexton place, because I was gonna say universality, but like basically making it seem like there's a universal womanhood, there's a universal manhood, there's a universal queerness that looks the same for everybody universally, and then you just apply Black to it. And that's not how Blackness works. And so it's not like people are like, oh, well, all women have the same experience, and then you put Black on it, and all men have the same experience, and then you put Black on it. And that's not like Black womanhood is a specific womanhood experience. That's not the same as white womanhood. That's not the same as, you know, other racialized womanhood, because race and gender are interconnected in that way. And same for Black manhood, and same for like Black queerness. And I'm actually currently trying to work on something about, you know, how Black is kind of a queer identity in of itself, in that, you know, it functions differently than like normative gender and sexual identity, which being whiteness. And so basically the point I was trying to make, that I feel like I'm explaining very badly, is that like I have more in common with other Black people. I share a struggle with other Black people on the basis of Blackness that I don't have with white women on the basis of womanhood, or, you know, any other group on the basis of some universal identity. Like, me and white gays don't have nothing in common. And I don't pretend like we do. We're not the same. And like, I'm tired of people trying to condescend to me about Black experiences, who are also trying to link our struggles to people who don't have our struggle. And it's something I encounter a lot in online spaces. And then people will, you know, like kind of patronize me for the way that I center Black people and all Black people, Black women, Black men, Black children, and try to, especially when it comes to Black men, will try to tell me that Black men have privilege because they have a universal manhood that's the same as white men. And it's like, if you don't understand that basic level of gender and racial identity, where like Black manhood and white manhood are not the same, then we don't have nothing to talk about. If you don't understand that Blackness functions differently, and we're not trying to assimilate or mimic or model or be like white people, then we don't have nothing to talk about. You can do that over there, and we don't have nothing to discuss because we're having totally different conversations.
Period. Yeah, and like, this is why we talk about being a colonized people. If you know the ways in which dominant white masculinity colonizes and makes of colonial subjects other masculinities and subordinates them, and in fact strives to exterminate in the colonial situation, you exterminate the men and you enslave, and you know, the women and children, right? Anyway, so yeah, so to this idea that, you know, Black men aspire to some sort of white patriarchy and this is not to say that there's not sexism, misogyny, and other malformations in our community, but to say that Black men objectively strive to a dominant patriarchy is like, okay, well, read something else.
And then
or go that, like you said, go that way. That's a different conversation than
exactly.
Jared
said no comment, Jared.
No, I mean, no, really. There was what else can I say? All I kept thinking is find the privilege in that. As you were talking about, the men get killed off first, and listen, all of that. You know, find the privilege in that.
I've had people talk to me about Black male privilege for years, and I've asked over and over again what this male privilege is, and I've never gotten a clear answer. It's always like some vague, weird, like, I don't even know. It's usually like a pathological demonization that Black men commit all this violence, and the privilege is them being able to commit this violence. And it's like, okay, well, again, now we're not even having a conversation that's worth having, because if the basis of your conversation is that Black men and boys are pathologically violent and are born violent, it's a bioessentialist claim that they're just born to enact violence, then there's nothing for us to discuss. So
you're not getting an answer because it's just a career choice. That's why.
That part.
Next week.
It does make good money.
So the other one I picked out technically is not your original tweet, but I think you should be given credit for what you retweet and then elaborate on your thread. And because when I found it just resonates so much with my own personality, someone who is constantly saying that anger is an underrated emotion. You retweeted and elaborated on, in fact, well, you said here, it was said, sustainable rage sustainable rage. Can you share more about this point that has been impactful for you? Part of this, but it was about sustainable rage, learning to work with rage the same way that you had to learn to work with grief. Was the follow-up, and I wanted to have you, if you would, elaborate in terms of what you thought about that, why it was important to have on your timeline and to read, to elaborate on. But this issue of sustainable rage, and dealing with that in terms of having to constantly deal with and work with grief.
Okay. So it's funny enough because I always want to say I'm working on a piece about, because I have like writing ideas in my head all the time, and I have like little notes everywhere about things I want to write about, but then I never actually have the time to sit down and write. So like, I think I'm lying. I don't know if I'll ever actually publish the pieces that I'm working on, but I do have ideas around this idea of like shared trauma and anger itself being a radical politic, or something that we can organize and be radical around. And something that I'm currently reflecting on is like how like it has to be more than that. There has to be love. There has to be investment. There has to be hope. There has to be goal setting. There has to be community building. We're not gonna be able to organize with people just because we're mad about the same things. Like, okay, yeah, we're mad together, but then what do we want to do with that anger? Do we have the same goals for what we want to do with that anger? Because some people are mad, and they're mad because they want power. They're mad because they want access. They're mad because they want to, be in those spaces. Whereas I'm mad because I want those spaces to not exist. I want to tear down the walls. I want to tear down the institutions. I want us to be free. I want Black children to be safe. So us both being harmed by something and being angry about something is not enough for us to build together on. And so like, I think about that when I think about sustainable rage, is like, what am I angry about, and what am I doing with that anger? And again, everybody's cause does not have to be my cause. Especially being on Twitter, I see a lot of people angry about things that involve celebrities. Colorism discourse is always about who celebrities are dating, which rappers dating which light-skinned girl or whatever. And like, it's always about, an actress got passed over for a certain role or whatever. And like just different things that like, they're like, this is the misogyny and sexism that we deal with. This is not the misogyny and sexism that I deal with. There's nothing like the conditions that I'm living under. And these things are not life-threatening for the ways that they are for poor people. The things that they talk about in the media are not. I actually just watched the interview with Dr. Jodi James the other day. And like one of my favorite parts was when she talks about how there's this like mass application of identity or whatever that pretends that people who are, wealthy experience anti-blackness and systemic violence the same way that poor people do. And that's just not the case. We talk about police brutality and mass incarceration. And then people talk about, yeah, those things are bad. And that's why, I should get a promotion at my, corporate media job, or like these things are not the same. So it's like, everybody's cause is not my cause. I don't care about rich people getting richer or not getting the amount of access they want. I don't care about what's happening with any fucking celebrity ever. I don't have to be outraged at everything that everyone else is outraged about. I'm outraged at, poor Black children being policed in their communities. I'm outraged at poor Black single moms not being able to be able to feed their kids. And so it's like picking my battles, remembering what I fight for, who I fight for, prioritizing that always. And then not just being outraged and angry, but also being goal and solution oriented and figuring out what I can do to combat these things, and then doing it and not just talking about it. So that's what resonated to me about that concept of sustainable rage.
Right on.
Nina, this has been amazing. Not only does your Twitter timeline break it all the way down and keep it funky, like I've told you before, like I don't think that you are have a PhD or whatever and are academic, but you have probably better class analysis than most of my colleagues.
Well, thank you.
I don't know about me. I study, but not, but it might. But I mean, I
would never make that claim.
No, but I will say you do it from, as you say, from your what I call structural location as a generationally poor person, right? And I think that literally, to the point, the standpoint of epistemology is whatever to me, but like from your standpoint, I think that actually gives you such a trenchant and spot on analysis. Because as you're saying, like, ain't no motherfucking trickle down analysis. Like these bourgeois
Right.
Negroes can't tell us. They're not invested in actually analyzing the material conditions of the majority of Black people. And so I think like what I love about your timeline is that you keep 100 and you provide such good analysis and such good hot takes. And then you be dragging these bums who come on there with all like, I think
they always
they're too sensitive.
They do.
Yeah.
I get blocked more often than anything because, again, I'm reckless, like I will hurt your feelings. And then also, like, people can't out argue me. I don't talk about shit that I don't know about. Other people should try that. But then also, like, I think it just like it I get a lot of pushback that I don't see other people get pushback for saying the same things. And I've been talking to a good friend of mine about this recently. And I know a lot of it is that I'm not an academic. A lot of it is that I'm a poor single mom, a poor Black single mom who grew up with nothing, who's been in and out of homeless shelters, in and out of domestic violence situations. Like, and people don't, I think people like see me say certain things and like assume that there's this like academic background around it or whatever. And then like when it becomes clear that's not what I'm about, they get offended because people still hate poor people and they still hate poor Black people and they still hate loud poor Black people. And how dare you? And especially like people who did go to college and do have their degrees and like to flex their credentials. Like they like, no way in hell that this person who didn't go to college thinks that they're going to tell me anything about anything. But like, again, like, I know what I know and I'm not scared of you niggas. You can't hurt my feelings. So I'm gonna say what I have to say. And again, it's never nothing that's gonna trickle down. And every time I see anything that's starting out not on the ground with poor Black people, that's not starting out in community with poor Black people, that's not starting out getting fucking food in the mouth for poor Black children, then we're already starting off wrong. We're not gonna stabilize it. Like the left idea of like we'll build networks or whatever and then we'll take those networks and we'll go into community, to me is not any different than like the Black capitalist saying I'm going to start my business and then when I reach $1 million and I'll put the money into community or whatever, blah blah. It's like we'll get ourselves together first and then we'll come and we'll worry about you guys later. Like, to me, like that's not how it works. It starts with like actual sacrifice in real time, in community, and investment in community with people who are the least secure, who have the least resources, who have the most need right now today. That's where we start.
Period. Thank you so much for being on, Nina. This was amazing. This was dope.
Yes.
Follow at Wild Fonts. If you are not following this account, what is he doing?
Actually, I just changed my @ on Twitter from Wild Fonts because I'm changing the name of my blog. But I'm just at Nina Monet right now.
At Nina Monet. Okay, so scratch Wild Fonts at Nina Monet. That's NinaMonei.
Yep.
Oh, it's on the screen. All right. Thank you so much. And I hope to have you back again soon.
I would love to be back. It was good talking to you guys. I hope you have a good rest of your day.
Thank you.
You too.
All right, y'all. We have had such a long, amazing show so far. So I'm just going to keep it real short and sweet for what I'm on. And that is my book proposal is under external review. So when you're writing the book, you can get an advance contract, which means that you send a proposal in a couple of chapters, or you can get the whole book contracted. And so I'm doing the former, that is to say an advance contract. And so the editor emailed me, told me that he got one of the reviews. He's waiting for the second review. And then if those both are positive, then I will be offered an advance contract. I will not say which press it is, because don't be nosy. But so that's great. And so basically, I will say I had a book under contract before, y'all. So the book I'm working on now, Black Scare, Red Scare, is not the first or second book I've written. So as y'all know, I co-wrote the Du Bois book, but the very first book I was working on fresh out of graduate school was called Epistemologies of Blackness. And this was actually already under contract, advanced contract with a particular press. It came down to the fact that number one, Epistemologies of Blackness is like battle rap. It is a very, very critical book. It's critiquing a lot of the dominant ways in which we understand Blackness in Black studies. And so as I started to work on this text, I was like, this can't be my first book. This is a second book. I want to contribute something before I begin to sort of dismantle systematically some of this other stuff. And the other thing too is that some of the terms of that contract were not necessarily the best. So for example, the book will only come out in hardback. And for this particular press, the hardbacks are very, very cost prohibitive. So I was able to get out of that contract. But going through that process, what I will say was that the external review I got for that book, it was really, really good. It was so helpful. And a lot of the reading I've done around sort of class and the intersections of race and class formation in the Black community came from recommendations from that first external review. And I've tried to find out who it was because I wanted to thank them for that amazing feedback for that text. But all of that to say, so for My current text, Black Scare, Red Scare, I feel pretty good about getting this advanced contract, which will be good because that will also set a sort of a firmer deadline for me to work back from. So I'm feeling good about that. I'm looking forward to reading the comments. I'm hoping that they're useful and have some good suggestions for the directions the book might go. Like the first set of external reviews were for my other text. By the way, that book is halfway done. So after I finish Black Scare, Red Scare, I'll return, finish up that book, start on my Doxy Wilkerson book. I'll talk a little bit more about Doxy Wilkerson next week. But anyway, that's what I'm on. So Jared, do you have any closing thoughts?
Yes, I have two quick thoughts. One, the proposal is fire. So I cannot wait for the book to come out. And I can't wait for people to see it. And I can't wait for the discussion. And I can't wait for, well, all of the projects, but the evisceration book to come out after that. I can't wait for that either. The second thought I had very quickly is that in the two interviews that you did, both of which were incredible, there is this thread of Black women being silenced both in and outside of the academy. Both guests, without prompting, without scheduling, made the same point about how they had been silenced in favor of male counterparts, again, both in and out of the academy, which is pretty deep. And as soon as a man said whatever they had, said already, it was like, oh, that was deep. Anyway, so I just, but a fire show, an incredible episode 4. So congratulations.
Thank you. That's so interesting. I've been told that I moved through the world as a white man because I wish a motherfucker would try to silence me. I don't know. I mean, I'm sure that it's happened, but I'm just I'm just so belligerent that it's kind of like, fuck this shit. No, but anyway, y'all. So for this show, right, a longer show. So by the way, somebody did comment like, is all these shows only going to be 30 minutes? Here's a longer show for you. But so what did we do today? We shot the shit about Black Power Media, about our launch, about if we are going to continue to curse, what those developments might be, right? I had an interview with my girl, my comrade, my sister friend, Dr. Layla Brown Vincent. Don't forget to look her up on Twitter and on academia.edu. We had a great discussion in these tweets with the amazing Nina Monet, at Nina Monet, about her fire timeline and her always prescient analysis. And then for what I'm on, I just briefly talked about, this book, my book proposal being under review, hoping that goes well and hoping to get this contract. That's our show for this Friday evening, y'all. You could have been anywhere in the world, but you're here with me. I'm Dr. CBS. That is Jared Ball, and we are signing off.